Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Sunday Shot as we creep ever closer towards the end of the year. It's great to be back with you on a Sunday morning. I am recording this from Gadigal country, the land of the mighty Yaara people. And I am joined today, as ever, by my co-host and editor of The Shot, Dave Milner. Dave, hi.
Joe, hi. How are you?
I'm very well. How are you going?
I am in the middle of writing a piece called Hyper-Wealthy, Genocidal, Pedophilic Dickheads versus Humanity. So,
Oh, okay.
that's the working title. They don't always end up sticking, but sometimes they do. So other than that, I'm okay. Yeah.
It's a pretty persuasive title, I think, and probably is what it says on the can. So,
Pretty shortish, so we might go with it.
yeah, we look forward to reading that. Making her debut with us this week on the Sunday Shot is Lorena Allam. Lorena, thank you very much for coming and joining us here today.
You're very welcome, Joe. Thanks for having me.
Very exciting. And not as exciting because he's an old hand at the Sunday Shot these days, but he is just back from Brazil, and COP is Royce Kurmelovs. Royce, hello.
Hello, I'm here to bring the tone down.
You are indeed. And we won't hold any kind of misspeaking against you because we know you're very jet-lagged.
Thank you, it's very kind.
Now, we're looking forward to getting into that and hearing all about your experiences at COP. Before we do, a little roundup of the news of the week. Ukraine, I don't know, there are as many peace plans as there have been almost Russian military offensives there, and I don't think we're any closer to actually peace on the ground. The Americans seem to adopt a 28-point peace plan that was actually very close to a lot of the Russians' talking points, Dave. It didn't really seem to be that you give up something, we give up something, but rather you give up everything and we'll take your national identity.
I cannot claim to know the ins and outs of this agreement, but I do understand US imperialism in the modern age quite well, so none of this surprises me very much. It's extractive capitalism for resources. And, we're seeing this everywhere. We're seeing this in Gaza. Royce, do you have a different take on this?
No, I don't necessarily have a different take, but what I do think is that there is some context to this, in particular that Trump has not liked Zelensky since Zelensky sided with the Democrats against him during the previous term in office. And essentially his presidency has been doing everything he can to humiliate the Ukrainian government and specifically Zelensky in retaliation. And, this... the confusion around the plan, the proposal of the plan that kind of gives everything to Russia has kind of been building for a long time, particularly as Trump has repeatedly signaled that he's not particularly interested in pouring more money into this conflict. And even as you have Europe saying, yes, we will step up to support you, when it comes down to the crunch, you have a lot of European states that say, actually, we don't really want to, spend an additional money or risk anything in this. And you wind up with what is a very bad, messy situation in Ukraine currently, unfortunately, for the Ukrainian people.
The Europeans didn't even know about this plan, it seemed, until they read about it in the news. And it did contain some just things that would be unacceptable to Europe, let alone to Ukraine. NATO wouldn't be allowed to station troops in post-war Ukraine. There'd be no European peacekeepers allowed there. They were going to, NATO would have to formally refuse any admission of Ukraine in the future. They would have to hand back more territory than Russia had been able to win on the battlefield, unfreeze the billions of dollars of Russian funds, which actually a lot of the Europeans were hoping would be used to rebuild Ukraine. It just couldn't get really worse. And then, of course, we had the transcript of Witkoff's conversation with Russian officials, where he basically seemed to be completely on side with the Russians, honouring Putin and telling the Russians how to handle Trump, Lorena. So all up, it just seems, Ukraine was being left to hang out to dry, as indeed were the Europeans.
Yeah, whatever's good for Russia is generally not good for the rest of Europe. And this peace deal, so to speak, is very much based on what Russia wants. It's interesting that Russia is now dictating US foreign policy. There are strange times we live in, that we've gone from Reds under the bed to Reds in the White House, telling them.
Global establishment allegiances to each other. It doesn't seem to have national boundaries the way it once did in the Cold War.
I think it's and Trump loves strong men. He values a good deal, so he's trying to strike a deal with a strong man who clearly we know Putin has information about Trump and Trump's past dealings that might be a bargaining chip in this somewhere that hasn't yet come to light. So I think Trump will do what he'll make a deal that suits him and not really care what the consequences are for Europe.
And it did seem that Witkoff was sort of saying, well, we all know in the end we're going to have to give you Donbass. He seemed to be saying to the Russian officials, and that is the way that we will make peace. The Europeans have successfully fought a rearguard action with conversations in Geneva with Rubio, who does seem to be the reasonable one within the Trump administration, and they've at least conceded at this point that they can't be sort of wrapping up in the peace deal anything which is going to impact on Europe without Europe having a say, which is very generous of them. But we'll see what happens.
It's generous of you calling Mark Rubio reasonable, as a token reasonable guy.
He's the reasonable one within that administration, so it's all relative.
God, the bar's low, isn't it?
In that administration, the bar is certainly very low.
Through the looking glass completely. This is why, we're talking about these strange alliances that we're seeing form globally. It really is. It's a new world we're living in where unexpected friendships pop up.
Sorry, but there is a sort of logic to it for the US, at least, when you're looking at it from a realist perspective. What Russia is essentially asserting is an old school idea of spheres of influence, and the US wants to do the exact same. It's the same. It's and so there's an attraction there for the US administration where if Russia gets to do this in its own backyard, the US gets to do whatever it wants in its backyard, which is why we've had headlines currently of which is why the US has been striking at fishing boats off the coast of Venezuela. We have headlines about the potential for conflict and a regime change in Venezuela. We have the US throwing its rate around other places. So, I'm not, and personally, I'm not necessarily convinced that this is the Trump administration kind of being in the pocket of Putin. It's just the Trump administration recognizing that if you can carve up the world this way, it is very beneficial to their own plans and machinations.
They're tyrants of a similar ilk, as you say, etching out spheres of influence, behaving quite similarly. I do think the thing that's most different, though, and I know that this is where I differ with sort of the liberal opinion of Trump, is that I don't actually think America's behaving that differently. I just think they're not bothering with the myth-making and the PR machine as much. If you look at American foreign policy for the last 50-odd years, they've been on these extraction sprees. They have killed tens of millions.
That's certainly the case, I think, with Venezuela, but it isn't the case in terms of in the last 50 or 60 years anyway, the relationship that they've had with Russia. So
that is different. Sort
of swapping sides there is our own special treat for the years, the time in which we live. To turn to more domestic news, we're not going to say much about Barnaby because Barnaby just wants us to obsessively talk about him, and so far all he's done is resign from the Nats. So until something more happens on that, I think we'll consign him to oblivion. High Court ban of social media, because as a parent of a 13-year-old, this is exercising our household, and my son is merrily going about setting up fake accounts with different birth dates, as are all of his friends. And apparently a lot of 13, 14-year-olds have now sent something called Lemon 8 as an app to the top of the app stores here in Australia. There's one which is the version of Snapchat, which has not been banned, and there's one which is a replacement for TikTok, which has not been banned. So, because they had been hitherto so obscure, but they'll be powering up the app charts as a result of Australian teenage agitators.
I don't remember much from Year 12 legal studies, but I do remember that John Loco, my teacher, said that for a law to be a good law, people need to know about it and it needs to be enforceable. And I'm just not seeing that last part of the measure being met there. It's kids are good at this stuff, right?
I mean, they're better at it than we are.
Mm.
Certainly in my experience. But there are now two enterprising young teenagers, 15-year-olds, Noah Jones and Macy Nayland, who are bringing a high court case challenging the ban, saying that it impermissibly burdens their implied freedom of political communication. I don't know about this, Lorena. What do you think? I mean, it seems that the government is able to ban kids from doing lots of stuff.
Well, they won't be banning any kids that have got any nous on how to get around the ban. We all, those of us who've got kids, know that they're already working out how to do it. It's interesting with these two teenagers who've joined this campaign by, I think it's I forget the coalition.
It's John Ruddock of the Libertarian Party.
Yes, so these kids will obviously be the face of their court challenge to this really, wobbly law, in my opinion. It's not enforceable, as Dave says, and I think it's a bit of a distraction from what we really need, which is, for the government to get tough on disinformation on these platforms and to get tough on racism and race hate and hate against minorities on these platforms. And rather than deal with the actual problem, this is a kind of maybe our 13-year-olds don't think so, but it is a side issue. As a parent who tried to regulate my children's access to social media, I think there's some benefit in this for parents to be able to say, that you're not the last line of defence against the bullying and the exposure to really disturbing content online. But the fact that our kids are being exposed to that is the problem, not their capacity to use or to avoid the platform. It's like, if you clean up the platforms, you don't need to ban children from them.
That's exactly right.
It's in the wrong direction.
And if you made the platforms accountable for the content that they are amplifying as publishers, rather than just sort of weirdly context-free vehicles, it seems, that would make a big difference.
I agree entirely with the both of you on this, but I think the problem is that the power dynamic is completely out of whack here, and that governments aren't powerful enough to enforce any sort of control over these social media companies now. These tech giants are bigger than lots of companies.
They could do more. I mean, even in Europe, there's a great deal more protections for consumers, privacy protections around surveillance. We are kind of outliers when it comes to this sort of open slather approach that we have had. And then, the platforms have been very angry with the Europeans and the EU for enforcing some of these protections, but they have had to follow them. All their threats of, we just won't let Europe use Facebook, revealed to just be the kind of ridiculously empty threat that it clearly is. So there is more that could be done, which isn't just this sort of sledgehammer that's going to come in and potentially be completely unworkable anyway. So we'll keep an eye on that. And then, of course, we had the news this week, which will lead us into our broader conversation about COP, that the government finally got their deal done, and thank Christ it was with the Greens and not with the Coalition on the Environmental Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act. Royce, I know you've been out of the country, but I presume, as this is in your wheelhouse, this is something you would have been following. The Greens did manage to win some concessions, even if they had to give up on, the big picture things like the climate trigger.
Yeah, I mean, look, this has been, in some ways, this has been a long time coming, and it's been a big question about whether the government would side with the Coalition or the Greens over this. And I think it was, all the reporting on this suggests that the Coalition expected to do a deal with the government, but kept placing very irrational, kept changing their position up to the last minute. And I mean, I think the big letdown of these reforms, though, however, is the lack of any provisions to deal directly with climate change, or what is known as a climate trigger, that would allow the minister to review projects on the basis of the emissions that they would cause. And that's a huge glaring oversight that remains in this. That said, it is good. The creation of an EPA is good. The creation of more strengthened laws is good. Watching this from afar, like I said, I've been overseas the last 2 weeks as this became critical, so I haven't had a chance to look across all the detail. But for me, as observing this process, I I do have concerns that some of this idea of the abundance agenda and kind of smoothing processes will bleed into this. So I'm very curious to see how this plays out going forward and whether we actually do get any genuine protections for nature.
It did almost seem that the government's hand was forced, Lorena, in that the coalition were so hopeless that the government really had no alternative but to deal with the adults in the room, that they would be loath to concede are actually the Greens. But it seemed they were, and Albanese did call in Larissa Waters as well as Murray Watts and Sarah Hanson-Young to get this deal done on Wednesday night.
Yeah, and I think it was an interesting deal that the Greens managed to get. So I agree with you. The Libs are hurtling into oblivion on this, and it's just, I mean, as a lefty, it's very entertaining to watch, but it's distressing. The impact on our public policy is distressing, and as Royce just said, this is still just policy. Whatever deal that's been struck, we won't see the results of for years to come. And I do have some concerns just on the face of what I understand is in the legislation, which is that there's a lot of discretion for the minister on whether you can determine whether a industry proposal is in the national interest, and especially determining compliance with environmental laws. And I was around and reported enormously on the Jukan Gorge disaster in 2020, when it was clear that the federal minister was aware that the explosion was about to take place and chose not to do anything, even though they had the power under Section 10 of the Environmental Protect the Heritage Act. So having too much discretion, and other times when the minister in previous Conservative governments has just overrode Indigenous rights or environmental concerns to allow mining or exploration or fracking to go ahead. So giving a minister that degree of discretion is alarming in my view. So it would be interesting to see how that works in practice and whether or not that discretion just ends up tied up in the courts. So once this legislation is enacted, who's going to be the first industry group to take it, to challenge it all the way to the High Court, to just push the envelope? Because they will, because they can afford it. And they'll probably be already preparing their cases. So,
and if the history of the Australian courts is, and to your point, if the history of the Australian courts is anything to go by, decisions generally on average fall in favour of business, who have more resources, more time, and who can read the legislation in their favour. I mean, One of
the things that I was also kind of interested in, a little bit perturbed about, is that the EPA is now going to be able to enforce, they have beefed up powers to enforce minimum national environmental standards against which development applications and the like will be judged. But all of those standards have yet to be introduced. They are all going to be added via regulation from government. So nothing else has to return to the Parliament. But there's a lot of work that it seems still has to be done. Now, some of this is process related. They couldn't introduce the standards until they had the overarching legislation through and in place. But we've only seen about 2 of these standards to date. So there's still like a lot of unknowns when it comes to exactly what the standards will be to which developers will have to conform. Royce, have you had any insight into that as yet, or is that something we'll just watch this space actually for us all?
No, this has been actually a very interesting point, and this is one of those things that tends to be very technical. People tend to tune out of, but is actually extremely important, and it's something that, if I recall, has characterized a lot of the way the current Labor administration has conducted its business. It tends to write laws and then write regulations to backfill, which means it doesn't have to go to Parliament, which means those things aren't contained in legislation, which means they can be changed easily in the future. And the risk of this is twofold. First off, it leads to badly drafted laws and incomplete understandings of what the law is. But also, second of all, if there is a change of government in the future, and say just hypothetically you have a conservative government gets in and is very hostile to, in this particular case, environmental issues, they can then rewrite the regulations without having to take that to Parliament, and so there's fewer protections in there. And and I've spoken to legal academics in the past who have criticized Labor for this because it makes the process vague, and it leaves multiple chinks in the armor, so to speak.
Yeah.
I always seem to play the cynical role on this show, but is it designed that way so that they can just extract as much as they fucking want as per usual?
Well, yeah, I suspect there is some truth in that. But yeah, we'll wait and see. I mean, also this week, as part of our kind of environmental conversation, if you like, Bowen had to read his annual climate statement into Parliament. And it was, they had to concede that we are not on track to hit our 2035 targets at all. They're saying, we probably do okay on, the 2030, but we're just shy of them, but there is quite a gap. And the emissions reductions that we are seeing, and I think we're at about 2.2% reductions this year, continue to come from the offsets program. And if we've learned anything in the last few years, generally, and certainly from friend of the show, Ketan Joshi, is that the offsets are just really dodgy. There's no integrity in that system. Lorena, it is a cause of concern that it does seem to be dodgy green accounting, which is getting us to the extent that we are hitting our targets, it is through this system.
I mean, if Bowen can stand up and tell us that we're wildly off track, if you listen to Larissa Waters, and we're headed for a catastrophic temperature rise. If their own dodgy green accounting can't hide how bad it is, then you've got to wonder how bad it really is. Because often, governments love figures, they love rubbery figures, and a lot of this environmental data can be presented as a shell game. The same way that they talk about closing the gap, the figures can be made tell whatever story the government desperately needs told. So, and here's my turn to be cynical, Dave. So when they say, we might be close to almost not being off track, you've got to, think of how seriously bad it really is. And I think it must be very bad. And my former colleague, because I used to work at The Guardian, Lisa Cox, has written at length about the offset system and how easily you can hide and fudge your, dodge your obligations if you're an industry body. The same way that our water market allows, dodgy operators to thrive.
So, Royce, if we're failing at a domestic level, you've just been at the big jamboree, which is the international conference on climate. How was it? Tell us about it. What's it like being there? Are the fossil fuel lobbyists as ubiquitous as we understand? What was your take on what was achieved? Look, we can go through these things sort of separately, and also want to touch on the fact that this conference was the one that had the highest representation of Indigenous delegates who were attending COP, and there were about 3,000, I understand. And of those 3,900 were actually there and able to be to participate in the official debates as well. So, your first impressions on the chaos.
Well, there's a lot of big questions, and I could talk to you for ages about this. But
take the podium, man.
So to begin with, this is the second COP I've been to. I was previously in Dubai in 2023 for COP 28, and this is important because that was the global meeting of international leaders where the world essentially decided that, agreed that they will they agreed to phase out oil, gas, and coal in line with the best available science. And it was the first time the world came together and agreed to that. The next year was in Baku, Azerbaijan, and that was kind of treated as a wash by people because it was hosted in a petrostate. And there was a lot of, going into Brazil, there was a lot of kind of curiosity and almost hope about what could be achieved in Brazil, even though Brazil itself is a major oil and gas producer, Petrobras being, I think, a large company there, and a few others. And what was interesting about this is that, when I landed on the ground, I was one of two Australian reporters there. Mark Tilley of Carbon Pulse was the other one, and so between us, it was a lot of running around. But there was, but and this COP was also significant because it was 10 years after the Paris Agreement was signed. So it was the first time that the world has kind of got to look back and see how much progress was made and what needed to be done. It was, like you say, it was meant to be an Indigenous COP where, Indigenous people were meant to be involved in this process to a significant extent. It was meant to be a COP of implementation about, like governments coming together to plan out how they're going to achieve the things that they had promised. And even from the very beginning, it was kind of one of those things where, there was some things being done in the right directions, but a lot of places where it fell down. For instance, when it came to the Indigenous Pavilion, that was built somewhere else outside of the Blue Zone where the main negotiations were happening. So that removed a lot of kind of the focal point for where Indigenous peoples from across the world, by the way, could come and kind of participate in this process. That said, like you say, there was a lot of representation of Indigenous people there. People were part of that process. People were around in the venue. People from like different places, different cultures, different peoples, and that was really good to see. And for instance, at the opening of the process, there was a big protest that stormed security. A couple of days later, there was another protest where a group of Indigenous people from the Amazon blocked the entrance to the Blue Zone and prevented people from entering, and as part to demand stronger land rights because their land was being opened up for shipping that would then feed into more mining and more forestry in terms of extraction and extractivism. And that protest got a result. In response, the Brazilian presidency declared, I think, I'm going to get the phrasing of this wrong, but essentially awarded, I think, 11 indigenous people's additional rights to more to their land in Brazilian law. That they said, look, this will not slow down the process of extractivism, but it will at least give you more control over this and give you more ways to kind of more agency in what is going on. So that was kind of a benefit. At the same time, this was also a COP that was heavily targeted by the oil and gas sector. I think there were some figures that put the number of people from the fossil fuel industry at around 5,000. There was, one of the biggest kind of collective groups there. These people kind of get through the door. Sorry.
How does that compare with official government dignitaries? So, in terms of numbers.
Well, good question. I mean, it dwarfed all of them. It dwarfed all delegations except for Brazil, which had an extraordinary amount of people because they were the host country, so they want to have a lot of people there. I cannot remember the exact ratio, but basically government delegations were outnumbered by the number of fossil fuel people there. And to be clear as well, that it's not like the fossil fuel industry gets together and says we're going to send a couple hundred people to this thing. What happens is they get in through government delegations, and the overflow party will get them through the door and give them a badge and get them through get them into the pavilion. The CEO of Total, for instance, the French oil company, came as part of the French delegation. The UK had a lot of CCS lobbyists working with oil and gas industry. I'm aware that the Australian delegation had one member from, I think, BP in their low carbon division, which is working on CCS. And then there's all this going on, and at the same time, you also had a really interesting change in geopolitical dynamics. For instance, the US officially stayed home. So they did not send a delegation, did not send negotiators, which kind of meant they were out of the way of this process. And China was much more prominent here because of its role in kind of producing green tech and flooding the market with this and bringing down the price of this stuff. However, a lot of the chief US negotiators still managed to get through the door under badges from different organizations. So, one of them, I believe, was in the pavilion in part of the negotiations under a Stanford University badge. And so there was all these kind of shenanigans going on. And then over the course of the week, I mean, obviously you had the Australia-Turkey bid about who would host the next COP, and that was kind of, you had dueling coffee and tea lines at the pavilions, which were right next door to each other, which caused a lot of, people made a lot of comments about that, and ultimately Australia lost for a combination of reasons, which we can go into if you want to. But that was a problem that was resolved at this COP, and it was, and the fight over that between the kind of brinkmanship that Turkey was playing in the divided domestic Australian politics that fed into that on the other side of this was kind of indicative of the overall whole process, because, during this, these meetings are meant to be where the world gets together to discuss how it's going to address climate change. And what we had was clear, and especially with the absence of the US, you had clear blocks forming determined to obstruct the process to protect the interests of fossil fuel producers. You had Russia and Saudi Arabia in particular were making objections to preserve, the oil and gas industries, which they're heavily dependent upon. And at the same time, you had other blocs and other nation states, particularly India and some of the African states, who are frustrated at the international system because under the rules, essentially the rich developed countries that embraced fossil fuels early on as part of industrialization are required to front up the cash to help other countries, decarbonize, but they're refusing to do so, whether that's because they're afraid of being attacked by right-wing populist leaders at home, or they just don't want to. The money that they've promised over a period of decades just hasn't turned up. And so these countries are saying, okay, well, you want us to go through this process. You keep talking about a phase out, but you're not willing to step up and do anything about that. And I think the other critical thing, and I will stop talking in a second, but
no, because you were there. This is fascinating.
You want to hear from you, Royce?
Well, but the other critical thing was the subject of a phase out, because and what happened and what was going to happen through the course of this process. This was not well covered, not well understood, well reported, but there was some talk about this idea of a roadmap, a plan to, we've agreed that we need to, move away from oil, gas, and coal. That was the point of this process 30 years ago. We agreed in, to 2023. How are we going to do that? That ended up coming to nothing from the internal process. That ended up being complete. In fact, the final statement, the final agreement that was made, ended up stripping any mention of fossil fuels, any mention of oil, gas, and coal, failed to agree to any sort of roadmap or plan. However, what was really interesting about this process was during it, Colombia formed a block of countries that publicly announced that they would set up a process outside the COP process to plan a phase out of fossil fuels, one that is not going to be obstructed by countries like Saudi Arabia and Russia and face that kind of political opposition. And even more curiously is that Australia joined. Australia signed up to this. And I have it on, and as I reported at the time, Australia actually intervened to negotiate down language as part of this the Columbia Declaration, as it was known, particularly around the International Court of Justice decision that found that countries can be held liable for continued oil, gas, and coal extraction. So, but then there was some hesitation about whether Australia would sign on in the end, along with Switzerland and Canada, who also raised objections. But Australia did sign on and did agree to this, very curiously, which entitles them to attend the first meeting of this bloc in Santa Marta, Colombia, in April next year. Now, what this means going forward is really interesting, because you have essentially, and it's unclear what happened here. I mean, Chris Bowen himself is onto this issue, has been pursuing, it has been working on this for some time, was behind the COP bid, was working hard on that. And him and the Pacific were behind the language at Dubai calling for a fossil fuel phase out. So it's not like Australia hasn't been active on this stuff. However, as soon as it got reported that Australia had signed up to this block of countries, you had the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, at the G20 saying, we're not doing that. Gas is part of the solution, which is a fossil fuel talking point, and kind of immediately watering this down. So what you have, I think, is a really interesting illustration about the tensions within Australia, and particularly within the Labor Party, where you have key figures and factions and groups within that party who are themselves involved with the oil and gas sector in some capacity. And you have other parts of Labor that understand the need for change, that recognize the threat posed by climate change and the need to do something, and are acting upon it. And then you have this tension now between the minister, like the environment, the climate minister, and the prime minister, and how that's going to play out, and other factors. And I think the final thing on this that I'll say is that there was one event, particularly on the second week on the Monday, where the head of DQ was appeared on a panel. And I asked a question of that. I said, and he made several comments that I think was interesting and powerful. He was particularly talking about how he saw the political landscape. And I'm going to summarize, I'm paraphrasing in my words here. I don't want to get a call from the DQ complaining that I misrepresented the departmental secretary here. But in response to a question that I asked, which was specifically, so how do you see this? How do you see this going forward? And also, what do you think about the ICJ decision? The comment on the ICJ decision was no comment. just a flat-out refusal to discuss it. And second of all, there was an implicit acknowledgement that that there seems to be this kind of consensus within a certain tier of the government, and particularly Labor, that politically climate change is a dead issue, that there's no votes in acting on climate change or going too strongly on climate change, and in fact, it may inflame certain parts of the electorate because you can only go as fast as the voters allow, and that seems to be constraining action. And that is being used to push back against demands from civil society and other critical groups who may want, people to take this more seriously. And to go back to what you're saying before, Joe, this kind of hole in our emissions where our transport emissions are rising, emissions aren't falling enough, this dodgy accounting, the reliance on land clearance to, sustain these reductions. To address that, you need money, you need to pry open the treasury, you need to more expansive programs to help people get the solar on their roofs, to get the batteries in the house, to get the EVs, to get the trains, to get all this sorts of stuff. But so far, Australia, we have Australia going slowly, even as other parts of the government recognize that there is a threat and that we need to do something about it.
I think there's a part of this government that recognizes it wants the good PR for being seen to do this stuff, but it is unwilling to really follow through on lots of that. Do you think we will send a BP greenwasher to this new conference as part of the delegation as well? Actually, no, more serious question. What other countries were there? Is it a BRICS thing or?
Well, it's a good question. That's actually a really good question because I forget these precise countries that are, I think there's something like 23, 24 of them in this particular block. And they include, they include the Netherlands, which is the historical home of Shell, and where there was a big climate lawsuit litigating against Shell about their historical emissions. But also Mexico, which is another big oil producer. So that was interesting. And then you have a constellation of smaller states, particularly in the Pacific. I think Tuvalu and Fiji are both part of this, and of course the Pacific are pushing their own initiative on this, which is the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. And so between this and then the Colombia Initiative, what you have is, and I say this with a big heavy if because there are many variables and it may not work out, but what you have is the beginnings of a kind of alternative legal diplomatic architecture that will interact with the COP process and allow countries that do want action and do actually want to plan this, because even if you agree, hey, we need to get rid of fossil fuels at some point, that's part of the process, we need to deal with climate change, you still need to work out how you're going to do that, because that's still a process. But you can't do that when you have people obstructing and won't let you even discuss it. So these alternative venues, these alternative mechanisms allow you to do that. However, it relies on people, one, turning up, two, and then two, booking material gains, actual kind of wins. And so there's a big question about whether Australia will turn up, what role it will play in that process, and whether this alternative process can get those wins, which will then attract other countries. Because once you have the plan or the ideas or the the roadmap, for instance, then it becomes much more attractive to join because it becomes the work is done essentially.
And Lorena, you'd have to say if there is going to be a contest between Albanese and Bowen, and take action and go slow with an eye at the politics, then Albanese shows he wins every time.
Yeah. But I'm struck by listening to Royce describe the I think you used the word shenanigans that went on at COP with the Indigenous pavilion, hundreds of Indigenous people from all over the world, some of them in, traditional dress, talking very clearly about what is essential to them, that is existential to them. Climate change isn't a geopolitical issue. It's about life and death, literally. And it's a sign of how serious this is that COP says, okay, well, you Indigenous mob, you can come and have the meeting and you can even come and sit in the room with us. We'll even listen to what you've got to say. But outside, it's Indigenous people who are literally in danger, who are the first climate refugees, the people of Tuvalu, the people in Africa, my own mob here in Australia. Indigenous people were present at COP really just as a metaphor for the world's conscience. It's really about them saying, look, we do really care about the environment. Who best to embody the environment but all the native peoples of the earth? Please come so you can give the impression that we actually give a fuck about. Am I allowed to swear on this show?
You can.
Yes,
The impression that we
absolutely, you can swear.
That these are the humans who are most closely connected to the planet. So let's have them in the room with us. Let's hear what they have to say. And on one level, that's good. But it's also a sign of how serious things are. that they're willing to entertain these conversations and to hear what we've got to say. Because, as I say, it's our people who are on the front line. The blockade was fantastic. There was an amazing photograph of the baby in the arms of Royce, correct me, what his name, the Brazilian head of COP.
Royce is
Sorry.
jet lagged. Be kind to Royce.
I don't want to say, if I get it wrong, I'm going to be very embarrassed. So, but yeah,
we know who you mean.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's also the Brazilian president is Lula, and then yes.
Anyway, sorry. It was a really moving photograph, and a really, in my view, explains the kind of the desperation that Indigenous people feel all around the world. That it's our bodies that are on the line, literally. And so, if you look at the shenanigans that went on, the only people that you can look to at COP who weren't talking out of both sides of their mouths were the Indigenous people. So if you want to hear what's really going on, you listen to them. That's my view. And in Australia, when you talk about any protection of our natural resources, it's the Indigenous protected areas and those rangers who are the front line protecting that, who are the front line monitoring climate change. And so much of our natural resources is in Indigenous hands to look after. So, you know, I hear this politics. This is all politics. It's about domestic politics and how prime ministers look to their own people. But ultimately, it's about the life and death of First Nations people around the planet. And it's hard to kind of take any of it seriously because that is true.
Well, that is, I'm afraid, a very sad segue into the interview that we have for you today, which is with Yaara Bou Melham, who, as of last night, is a Walkley Award-winning documentary feature director with her new film, YURLU COUNTRY, which is the story of the Banjima people and the way their country has been poisoned through the Whitnum asbestos mining. Now, we're going to start with the trailer of the film, and I will just warn any of our First Nations viewers that it will feature the imagery of people who have died.
Whitnum Ngambigona is the worst contaminated site in the Southern Hemisphere.
YURLU Mine manngana ng asbestos. What I'm gonna do here? All this rubbish, all the tailings. I will do it,
If you measure this tumor here, it's double the amount that it was before.
How big is the exclusion zone?
It's something like 46,000 hectares. I've made it my business to do it, to take this fight on to the state government.
Oh, no.
We've got to be extra careful with the younger ones. Early diagnosis is better than a late diagnosis.
There's no action plan to remediate. Traditional owners still not being able to access their country. Something needs to be done.
The house is all fenced off. Mum standing there with Sister Marjorie, where she actually was born, the birthing tree.
Oh, man, and we can't go back.
A lot of people buried there. I have a role to play here to make sure I advocate for my people. The tailings continually being spread by wind and by water. Poison country, I also say.
You made YURLU Country after you met the very charismatic Banjima elder Maitland Parker, but prior to that you were going to make a film that was more generally about sort of an audit of abandoned mining sites around the country, of which the Whitnum site was just one, albeit an incredibly egregious example thereof. Can you tell us a little bit about the original idea for the film and the extent of that problem?
Well, there are 60,000 abandoned mines across Australia, and many of them do have really terrible environmental and health legacies. And as you said, Whitnum is probably the most egregious example as the largest contaminated site in the Southern Hemisphere. Mining took place there up until the late 1960s. It was a blue asbestos mine, and 3 million tonnes plus of asbestos mining waste was just dumped in this stunning, pristine part of the world, which happens to be Banjima traditional lands. And so we started looking at, some of these sites around Australia and came across Maitland Parker and his story. And he's a Banjima elder. He's from that country. Obviously, Banjima people weren't consulted when this mine took place, when this environmental devastation took place, and the miners just closed up and walked away and left the mess there for basically all of us, the public, taxpayer, to deal with, and Banjima traditional owners as custodians of that country to also have to deal with.
It does seem extraordinary that, as you say, the miners could just pack up and walk away and leave the mess that they've created to be somebody else's problem. And is that the way that it is all around the country? They make the mess, they make profits from the mess, and then they leave the mess for others.
So Australia's mining laws aren't great. They're better than what they were in the 1960s, which kind of allowed this mess to happen in the first place. We have strengthened mining regulations, but there are a bunch of loopholes and ways to get out of remediation obligations. And I think the other thing that most Australians will be surprised about is that legally, a lot of these mines can leave their big mining pits behind and unfilled. So, for instance, in the Hunter Valley of New South Wales, which is like a wine-growing, horse, rearing kind of community, it's also a big coal mining area, and that is just going to look like a Swiss cheese moonscape once coal and fossil fuels shuts down. Once those mining operations shut down, a lot of those mining pits are just going to stay there. And that is totally allowed.
No requirement at all for
backfilling the massive mining pits. Yeah, there's remediation is required, and a lot of these mining companies are required to put down bonds to remediate those sites. But under Australian law, there's no requirement to backfill those mining pits, as opposed to the US, for instance, which since the 1970s has required mining companies to backfill mining pits. So yeah, it doesn't really match our expectations, and I don't think a lot of Australians realise that these regulations and what mining companies are allowed to do is actually, it doesn't meet our kind of expectations of what remediation is supposed to be or looks like.
So it's a very narrow definition of remediation. Australia, yet again, letting the mining companies off the hook. Who would have thought? So Whitnum on Banjima country, that was mined until about 1966 and then was closed in 1976 after there was more awareness of the damage that could be caused by asbestos. So the Crown is responsible for this sort of devastated area. They close down the town of Whitnum, literally erase it from the maps, but they do not then themselves step in to remediate the land effectively.
Yeah, and I think it's quite important to separate this from this being an abandoned mine problem. So yes, there are 60,000 abandoned mines across Australia, but this is the largest toxic contaminated site in the Southern Hemisphere. And the government, the WA government specifically, has been investigating ways to remediate the site since the 1980s.
So they've been well aware of the problem since the 1980s.
Well aware of the problem, looking at different options for remediating the site. it then, in some of the reports that it commissioned, the engineers warned them that if you do not remediate these tailings dumps, and they, if you see the film, these tailing dumps go for 40 stories high in this stunning, red gorge system, clinging to the side of it like a cancerous tumor. Like, it really does mirror what was happening with Maitland's lungs in a way.
Yeah.
And Maitland always said, the health of country is linked to our health.
Yeah.
That if you look after country, it looks after you. And, there was this kind of symbiotic symbolism there as well. But in any case, the WA government was warned by reports that it commissioned, as far back as 2006, that if it didn't remediate these tailings dumps, they will spread for hundreds of years. I quote, hundreds of years, they'll spread. And what we now have is this site, which is the exclusion zone itself is, about 2/3 the size of Singapore, 5 times the size of Sydney Harbour. I mean, we're talking like a huge, scale here, 46,000 hectares. The contamination is now outside the exclusion zone.
Yeah.
So that border is arbitrary now. And this was completely foreseeable because the government had its own engineers warning them in the reports that they were commissioning that this was what's going to happen if you did nothing, if you just left it to spread. And in fact, Banjima people have engaged lawyers who are looking into litigation prospects for them. And they've likened this to, this sort of contamination is at a Chernobyl or Fukushima scale, except at least those sites have been contained. Like, the contamination there is not spreading, whereas at Wittenoom, the contamination is spreading, and the government knows this.
So obviously there have been very significant health risks and indeed fatalities as a result of this for the Banjima people. Can you just talk us through some of the consequences for country and culture as well as the people themselves for the Banjima?
Yeah, Maitland speaks a lot about this in the film, and he kind of felt that harm to country so keenly, not just because he was harmed, but he's a custodian of that country. And in the beginning of the film, you kind of see him walking into the contamination zone clad in plastic, wearing a face mask. And, there's this kind of real dissonance where you see an elder of a country not being able to interact with it without having to wear this protective equipment. And it's extraordinary and speaks to, this kind of aspect of safe access. But also, what are we prepared to accept when it comes to, profiting from land?
And as you say, there is this sense that if action isn't taken, the risk is only growing as the contamination site spreads. So the Banjima continue to be at long-term risk of ongoing illness, fatal illness from this site and these tailings.
Yes. Banjima people don't have a country, don't have a town on their own traditional homelands anymore because Wittenoom was erased. But they are still frequenting the area. And, that's something it's hard to tell someone not to go to your own country. And, it's hard to say, don't go for bush tucker in that area as well. I mean,
do ceremony.
Do ceremony. I mean, this is how they maintain culture as well. Pass on knowledge and stories. And so, Banjima are seeking that safe access again. And it's not just for Banjima people. I mean, this is an area that's frequented by many Australians, and there are lots of mining operations in the area. And, neighbouring Aboriginal communities as well are also worried about the spread of the contamination because the Wittenoom Gorge area gets these, monsoonal floods going through it. And so the the tailings, which is the mining waste laced with asbestos, you know, it gets pushed out onto these marshes and then into waterways and can, you know, go upstream to other communities. So I think there is that kind of real, there's that fear, and there is this concern that, you know, this isn't just becoming a problem for Banjima people, but for other communities outside there. And the other thing about asbestos, which is different to, like, you know, Fukushima and Chernobyl in that, with their nuclear problem, is that asbestos has no half-life. So once it's in the environment or out dispersed, it is there forever unless it's dealt with. And so the longer this is left to fester, the more people will be exposed, could potentially be exposed, and the harder it will be to actually to fix. I suppose, you know, and this is something that happens writ large around Australia. Back in the 80s and 90s, people weren't thinking about the traditional owners and their rights. I mean, Banjima people didn't even have native title over that land then either. The asbestos waste wasn't something that there was, you know, there wasn't anyone agitating for a cleanup of the asbestos waste, as far as I could gather from our research. And that really changed with Maitland.
Right. Yeah.
And it almost became like this light bulb moment for a lot of people who were active on Wittenoom and, you know, feel really connected to what happened in Wittenoom in the 80s and 90s, especially those lawyers. You know, even Peter Garrett and Midnight Oil, you know, their song Blue Sky Mine was about Wittenoom.
Yeah.
I think it almost was like this, oh my goodness, of course, they haven't actually fixed the problem. Yes, we were able to help advocate for the rights of, you know, workers and residents who got sick, but nobody paid attention to the environmental and health impacts that were going to be ongoing because the waste had just been left there.
So since 2015, when there was that WA government report that you referred to, has there been any other action from the WA government at all in response to advocacy from Maitland or others?
So Banjima people and their lawyers have met with the WA Premier, Roger Cook, and some members of the government to discuss remediation options, or whether or not that is something that they're going to work towards. That's still ongoing and active. But Banjima people and their lawyers say that, you know, if they don't hear, you know, positive signs, you know, they are ready to litigate before Christmas.
Before Christmas this year. So the clock is really ticking at this point.
The clock is ticking. I think what's important to remember here is that there have been successive reports looking into remediation options. There have been parliamentary inquiries in the 90s recommending a cleanup. Those recommendations were ignored. There has been report after report about how to clean it up. The last kind of correspondence or internal correspondence we received under Freedom of Information showed that the government decided not to clean it up, not because, you know, it wasn't a possibility, but because of costs. And we're talking about one of the wealthiest mining states in the world that received, you know, $13 billion in mineral royalties in 1 year alone in 2024 financial year. So, you know, it's quite staggering. And I think something that the CEO of the Banjima Native Title Aboriginal Corporation has always said is, we can't wait another 60 years for action. Like, now is the time. This is a decade to fix it. You know, there's been 6 decades of inaction. You know, it's now or never.
So, Lorena, it's very confronting to hear about that, and to hear that a site over in WA, Banjima country, has actually got, in some ways, greater health risks associated with it now than Chernobyl and Fukushima.
It is shocking, but it's not the only place in Australia where that's the case either. I mean, Aboriginal land, I can think of a number of examples. There's the Red Bank copper mine in the Northern Territory, which has been leaking acid into the waterways since 1996 that hasn't been remediated. There's the Rum Jungle uranium mine. There's MacArthur River, where the lead levels are in the water are phenomenal. There's the bauxite mine at the Rio Tinto mine of bauxite at Yurlulu that still isn't cleaned up. There's got the gold mine at Mount Todd. There's Ranger Yaara. I could go on. And then there's the never-ending cleanup of British nuclear testing at Maralinga and Emu Spring. So I'm just listening to the story of Maitland and Banjima people. I had some things to do with Maitland and the Banjima people around the Jukan Gorge time. Yeah. And I can tell you that Banjima are on all fronts having to defend their country. If it's this non-stop kind of pressure to respond to mining applications and exploration applications, they have very little rights even now, post-Jukan under West Australian heritage legislation. Under the native title regime, they are required to negotiate an Indigenous land use agreement with miners and others before, they have a time frame over which they can negotiate that, after which all bets are off and mining companies can pretty much do as they please. The Banjima PBC is not a wealthy organisation. A lot of these PBCs are prescribed body corporates under the Native Title Act. Small organisations run by people with great dedication, like Uncle Maitland there, who's not with us any longer. So they are fighting on all fronts to defend their country. It is shocking that Wittenoom is still presenting a serious health risk. And the reason people don't care is it's presenting a serious health risk to Aboriginal people. Yeah. I mean, as far as the mining companies are concerned, surely their responsibility has ended. The remediation arrangements vary from state to state. There's no, as I understand it, Royce might be able to tell me, there's no federal overarching legislation to kind of hold them to account. So a lot of the companies are relying on mining arrangements they negotiated with state governments 20 or 30 years ago. I mean, there's still around in Arnhem Land, around Ubiri, Jabiru. They're still arguing about who's responsible for the remediation there, and that's decades later. So I'm really pleased that this film exists to show other Australians what it's really like for Aboriginal people trying to protect their country and trying to clean up the other people's mess that's been left on their country, and literally the price that they pay with their lives.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it was surprising to me just the extent of the way that the mining companies themselves can abrogate their responsibilities. So they, as I said in the interview to Yaara, like they've made the money and now they can walk away. That has got a little bit better, it seems, in some of the remediations. But you heard Yaara say there, and you're reflecting that too, Lorena, that it's not what we would expect. When someone says you have to fix up the land, you have to remediate, the standards to which they're being held fall far, far below what one might expect from the literal meaning of the word remediation.
Mm. And I would say in WA, which is a kind of a petrostate in itself, there isn't a great deal of appetite in government to do otherwise, because this is making the West Australian government a great deal of money too. Mm-hmm. So, it's interesting. I was thinking about the history of Wittenoom. It's named after, I think it's Frank Wittenoom, who was Lang Hancock's mining partner. They owned a property together. Well, they acquired a property called Mulga Downs, and I know that the frontier violence on Mulga Downs is the stuff of legend. So there's this long colonial tale in these stories as well, that how the land came to be owned by these people is, through bloodshed and violence.
Joe, when you told me about this story earlier in the week when we were planning the show, I found myself, stunned, feeling it, but also not surprised because it's just this pattern that happens over and over again. And it's imperial extraction. It's still that process because you are having, the land is originally stolen from Indigenous people, and then our economic system rewards maximum extraction of that resource to the point that, we're poisoning people. And I would argue that the problem isn't a hole in the laws not having caught up. The problem is the economic system that rewards this type of behavior. And that's why it happens over and over and over and over again.
Yeah, and I think because this is such an extreme example, I mean, it is the most toxic site, the waste dump in the Southern Hemisphere. You think if you can't deal with something this egregious, oh my God, what can we hope for? Now, as you heard in the interview, Lorena, the Banjima are planning on taking this to the courts. Christmas is the deadline. They are still engaged in some sorts of negotiations, but these things, and they're doing them in good faith. They want to try and resolve this outside of the courts. But as you heard, this has been going on now for 60 years. Do you think that the courts can provide a better vehicle for justice at this point for the Banjima and for First Nations people generally? Would we have to go down that path now?
I think so. Often the courts are where you end up, where you do get some measure of justice. You can't depend on governments to do what they say they will do. You can't force their hand in any other way. So I do think the courts are an important tool. The courts and the High Court is how we got WIC. It's how we got the Mabo decision. So I do think the courts can play an important role, even if it's in the process of the discovery of truth. Courts have powers of subpoena. They have standards of evidence, and even to be able to tell that give the full picture according to white-collar law. I think that's really important. Justice is. I don't know what kind of justice there can be in this case, where people have lost their lives, where the country is permanently damaged. So I think the definition of justice is, it's hard to know, but if it can be cleaned up, if governments and companies can be held to account for their actions, then I do feel like that's a bit of progress. And I think the Banjima people are so to be admired, that they have not given up this fight. Difficult as it is, they haven't given up, and I think it's really inspirational.
Royce, can I ask you to comment briefly, because we are running a bit over time, but we always do that here on the Sunday Shot. Just in relation to this question of the courts, the Australian climate case that we were discussing when you were last on the show with Isabel Renecki is going back to court on appeal. That was announced this week. I know you've been away, but have you had any kind of insight into that decision-making process? Perhaps the fact that there has been the ICJ advisory judgment in between Wigney handing down his judgment and now might make some difference?
No, well, in terms of decision making, it was always on the cards that was going to appeal, because essentially Wigney was, if you read between the lines, was basically begging for an appeal, and that's how the decision seemed to be written. This was just so it was, and it was. And it sets the stage for a high court showdown that could be really quite significant, and really kind of challenge some fundamental the fundamental way Australian courts have approached these issues. And it's also interesting in the fact that other kind of international kind of authorities have signed on to these cases, particularly after the ICJ advisory opinion, in which states the ICJ advisory opinion, which found that individual states could be held legally liable for continued fossil fuel extraction in all manners of law, across the entirety of international law, over and above the Australian objection that the only thing that matters is the Paris Agreement. And I think that showdown will be very interesting. The decision will be pivotal and could be potentially game changing. It could also not. It could also be a restatement of the status quo. We will find out. But I think to Lorena's point, which I think is very important, and when we look at Wittenoom, I mean, that is a festering sore on the Australian landscape. It is one that is the product and associated with Lang Hancock, who is a figure who set in motion, like political trends and currents in this country that we are dealing with today, whose daughter Gina is one of the richest women, is the richest woman in Australia and in some cases parts of the world, whose continued efforts to encourage extraction, like that kind of extractivism remain. And it is a symptom of that. Whether courts can address that, I mean, it's inevitable that the courts will have to decide that. I will be fascinated to watch that play out. And just, and it's the last place people go when they're desperate for justice to find any sort of solution. And my only final thought is, I actually really want to say this, is that interview you did, I think, was very significant, because you had someone who was being very calm, very collected, very reasonable in explaining what happened and why they did the story. But I think kind of that understated delivery really does not capture the sense of like the bastardry involved in what has happened here. And I think it should be a national shame, essentially.
Well, that was, I think, part of the reason why they did zero in on the story of Wittenoom and the Banjima and Maitland and Parker in particular. So that the film is still in cinemas, and so we'll put up a QR code at the end of the show where you can see where it's screening, but also you can donate to the court case, which could be coming up any day now. Unfortunately, we have come to the end of another episode of The Sunday Shot. As ever, I'm going to do a quick little whip round in case anyone has a top tip of something that they'd like to mention that they've been inspired by over the last week or are keeping their eye on the week ahead. Royce, let's start with you.
I mean, the only thing I have to offer is to keep an eye on what happens with Australia and this Columbia Association and kind of this continued conversation about a fossil fuel phase-out going forward. I think that is the ultimate question in our climate politics, and one that Australia will have to reckon with at some point, or it's going to get very expensive in one way or another.
Okay. Keep an eye on that. Lorena, any top tips from you?
Well, when looking at the world gets too much, I think there's always books and music. So I would say read Evelyn Araleuan's new book, The Rot. Her poetry is phenomenal. It's out this week.
Yep.
And listen to Jimmy Cliff, R.I.P. Jimmy Cliff. Beautiful music and to uplift the soul.
Yeah, that is a very good top tip in what can be sometimes pressing times. Dave, anything from you to finish up?
Just a shout out to the troublemakers and rabble-rousers in Italy who have done another general strike for Gaza. Friend of the show, Chris Hedges, is over there with Yanis Varoufakis and Greta Thunberg and interesting giants of the political left. So I suppose just watch his channel for some no doubt interesting stuff that'll come out in the next couple of days. And yeah, have a good Sunday, everybody. Cheers.
Have a great Sunday. Do, as ever, like us, subscribe to us, do all those things. Give us some cash so that we can keep going into the new year. We've got 2 more episodes of The Sunday Shot before we're going to take a much-needed Christmas break. So Dave won't be with us next week. He's got to be on dad duty. But I will be back, and we look forward to seeing you then.